internationally and nationally, been involved in all kinds of things, and has more than 11 books and 100 publications in his spare time. Along with his practice, research, and everything, so, as well as all that admin. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Esme. It's a pleasure to be here. There's some familiar faces here, and thank you all for coming. But there are some unfamiliar faces as well. So I wonder if, since we're a small group, would you mind if we went around, took 3 minutes to just hear a name and where you're from? Want to start at the back?
So I'm Marcus Schaefer in sociology here at St. George.
Right.
Jill Cameron, one of the upcoming workshop people, which has reminded me to do my work for you. So I'm on faculty in the rehab sector and also appointed at Toronto Rehab. And I specialize in caregiving post-stroke, but I do other populations as well.
Right.
My name is Sue Davidson. I'm Director of Training at the Ontario Community Support Association. And our association represents not-for-profit home and community support providers right across the province.
Oh, I'm Gerda Kagi. What hat? Age. I've been a caregiver. I'm on the board of Concerned Friends, who people living long-term care, and part of the advisory committee now of the Senior Pride Network. Fascinating group. Among others.
Thanks.
Great. Hi, I'm Gabby Goulet, and I'm here from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and my role there is Director of Professional Practice for the Complex Care Program.
I'm Zoe Levitt. I'm a social worker at the Toronto General in nephrology and geriatrics.
You know, we could spend some time just following all these.
Yeah.
We could.
links. Mark McAllister, I live at Hesperus Village in Thornhill, and I'm involved in a number of projects having to do with just shifting the narrative around dementia in the public.
I'm Kate Francis. I'm the manager of the Family Care Office here at the University of Toronto, and some of we provide our elder care workshops.
Oh, good. I talked to you.
My name is Aoife. I'm a PhD student at the Rehabilitation Sciences Institute and the Collaborative Program in Aging. And I'm an occupational therapist in my background, and my research is in the area of dementia, elders that are dementia caregivers, spousal caregivers.
Very cool.
I'm Maureen Coyle, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the collaborative program in aging and exercise sciences. And my work is focused around disability, representations of the aging body, intergenerational relationships, and particularly focused on dementia, intergenerational relationships.
My name is Phyllis Fine, and I'm a social worker. I'm interested in aging, caregiving, support to family caregivers.
I'm Genevieve Obarski from the Change Foundation, which is an Ontario-based health policy think tank, and we also fund some on-the-ground projects, and we're just launching 4 projects to try to make an impact on the interface between family caregivers and their intersections with the health and home and community care systems. Creating recognition around the caregiver role, etc. So we're looking for projects to do that.
Hi everyone, I'm Sue Bella. I'm also with the Change Foundation, and I work with Genevieve.
I'm Penelope Tyndale. I'm a retired psychotherapist, and I'm here as part of the Academy for Lifelong Learning, which has this year its first course on aging, actually. I think it's been avoided subject. And I'm on a committee for aging in place, trying to work through the new government policies and things in our condominium and in the distillery complex of 6 residential buildings.
Everybody knows Esme. And Susan.
Hi.
Who runs the place. Okay, so it's a very diverse group and interests. I've been working with geriatrics for a very long time, but in the area of caregivers for about a decade, really less. The center that I'm associated with is the Reichmann Center at Mount Sinai Hospital, which is, I think, one of the first centers of its kind to live within the healthcare system to be dedicated to the care of caregivers and to be comprehensive in its attitude and approach to what needs to be done. There's a lot more to say about all of that, but the context for everything I'm going to say comes out of the clinical development of the center and the depth of clinical, put it that way, understanding of caregivers. Why in a healthcare setting? Because caregivers have traditionally been viewed as an ancillary component to the disease element, which is dementia in this case, but any disease, and are a very good source of collateral information. Right? That's what you do when you go to the doctor. You tell the doctor about your husband, your parent, your friend. But nobody, or rarely, does anybody actually know how to inquire about the caregiver themselves, how to systematically then engage. In the area of dementia, the caregiver is it's a bit overstating it, but the caregiver is the only true treatment instrument for the management of dementia. We have lots of medical things that we are researching and lots of things that are going on, and there are things that can be helpful and guidance and so on, but if you really, where the rubber hits the road is the relationship between the care recipient and the caregiver, who provides that 24-hour maintenance and intervention. The medicines don't work very well, and most of what we deal with, therefore, is behavior and the impact of that on the caregiver. So that was the stimulus for creating this center, and as we evolved our approaches, trying to get the best way to figure out the best way to intervene, we developed our interventions based on the caregiver research that existed at that point, understanding where caregivers are most vulnerable and why. And then we chose interventions that would try to address in a targeted way those elements. And we took it upon ourselves to measure everything we do so that we can understand if we're actually having an impact on those things that are most relevant to enhancing and sustaining caregivers. So that's the kind of the background in a nutshell. What I would like to do is just take you through an overview of the topography of the work and the research elements of it, and talk. Maybe we can talk about what actually caregiver research should now evolve into, and what are some of the elements that need to be taken into account. So I'll speak a little bit about the assessment of caregivers, because I think our approach to assessment is still pretty ill-defined, and I'll tell you about the Dcig. The effective interventions approach, we've got a program called Caregivers, and I'll tell you a bit about the research in that. Then there is the question of, you can do good clinical work. If you develop something good, how do you actually scale that and disseminate it, and can you? So we've been having a run at that, and I'll tell you a bit about that. And then we've got two subpopulations we're looking at. One is the employed family caregiver, that is sandwiched between employment and home, and the other is rural populations, and we've begun to look at the technological delivery of our services to isolated caregivers, and this is one example of that. So that's probably enough for 45 minutes. We'll see how much of it we can cover, and feel free to ask or jump in. We don't have to cover everything. You know this quote, Rosalind Carter's quote, 4 kinds of people in the world? Those who have been, those who currently are, those who will be, and those who will need caregivers. Smart lady. So we know a lot about caregivers from this perspective, this kind of profiling of things. Very large scale studies that give us a lot of data, and of course people have delved further into that, people like Guberman that I'll talk about in a minute in Canada. So most people with dementia live in the community. Who looks after them there? Of course, it's predominantly family and friends, mostly family. 70% of those caregivers still are women, and often older themselves. So we're talking about a vulnerable population. And we know that caregivers are an at-risk group. I think this audience knows a lot about that, so I'm not going into that kind of stuff. But I would say this, that if we're going to go in a more refined way into caregiving, we have to refine our definition of what we're looking at. And because obviously that will determine the focus, the questions that we ask, and the nature of the inquiry. So what's a caregiver? You know, you'll be able to provide that definition yourself, and there are nice one-sentence definitions of caregivers. But I would say that we have to think a little bit more deeply if we're going to do things well. The first thing is, as we all know, that caregivers don't call themselves caregivers. They call themselves a husband or a wife or a daughter. And the nature of that self-identification actually, I believe, is quite important in understanding what it is that we want to research. Because if we look at it from the outside, we get one view of caregiving, which is instrumental in large measure. If we look at it from the inside, then we have to take into account the identity of the caregiver. Who are they, and what are they bringing to their role? Because that's going to determine their capacity to do the job and to survive. So I'll give you an example, just of a kind of complex caregiver. I apologize, this looked a lot clearer on my computer. But this is a disguised but real case, and I put it up there just to help refine the perspective on the complexity of what we have to take into account, both clinically, if I can put it that way, and in management, as well as in research. So Joan is 76. She's aged herself, in quite good health, married to Sam, who's had dementia for 8 years, so she is well embroiled in this. Sam can't talk anymore effectively. His wonderful language skills are gone, and she's always trying to figure out what he means, interpreting what he says, and he can't do anything independently himself. So he never leaves the apartment, and therefore she never leaves the apartment. She is, of course, exhausted, so there's the physical impact, and he gets very anxious if she's not around. So there is this sense of not just I can't go because he can't be left alone, but the guilt of I can't leave him because I will hurt him. When she goes out, we talk about respite. When she goes out, she never feels that she's part of the world. She's always got this sense of having a bubble around her that nobody can see. And so there's this invisible quality of being a caregiver. She carries the preoccupations with her. She talked a lot about that. And I encouraged her to do these things, but there is this wrinkle to it. So just providing care for somebody or services is not enough when they're struggling with this. She feels this alienation, and then there is this difficult to define element of what happens when the hero in your life is no longer there for you anymore. And she really began to fragment around that. So the nature of her relationship with her husband was, and not everybody has this, but for her, was a highly sustaining aspect of her own identity. As she lost him, she began to lose her sense of who she was in a deep, profound way, and she got quite depressed. Then she needed antidepressant care and psychotherapeutic intervention and management. So the caregiver is a complex black box, if I can put it that way, of many things. Now we know this just as human beings, but the system actually doesn't address this. So if we were, for example, going to do research on caregivers, what sorts of things do we have to understand? Well, we have to know that children are different than spouses. If we look at spouses, then we have to understand more clearly what are the adaptational challenges and how do those then impact affect and emotions, and what are the outcomes of those. I won't go into all of this, we don't have time, but loss of identity, intense emotions, especially guilt, for example, or anger, the undoing of relationship and who I am in the world leads to all of these factors. So what's the point? The point is that the research focus gets much more crystallized, I think, if we start to look at the factors that have to be understood, not just in the broad picture of the 250,000 caregivers for dementia in Canada, but in terms of what are the groupings or categories or caregiver subgroups, let me put it that way, because their needs are going to be different. So we have to refine our assessment. This is an approach that I've thought about. The first is, in caregivers, identifying the stage of their caregiving, because that's a different, each of these stages has different needs and has different impact, I think, based on the experience. We want to assess their readiness to accept help and to engage, and also the risk to them of what's going on with them. So we have to be able to assess that, and not just assess it in research studies, but assess it clinically. And finally, we need, on the basis of that, to create our interventions. So if you were going to develop a research, I don't know, a set of research interventions or protocols that you wanted to address, the questions that we ask, I think, would start to be defined a little more clearly if we could categorize and think about this differently. So I haven't put up all of the elements that go into the stages, but just to tell you that I think that the stage 1 coping is that what everybody's focused on now, this is early identification. And that's important, it's critical, but the needs of the early identified caregiver are different. Because they're relatively adaptive. They haven't lost the relationship, the communication, the engagement, the partnering. There are changes, for sure, but many of those things remain intact. They could still go out, they have a social life and so on.
Good. We have another attendee.
Is that real, or am I hearing things?
No.
Maybe he's aging.
He's aging. He doesn't know where he is.
Maybe he's a caregiver.
Maybe he is. Okay. Stage 2 is the longest stage of caregiving, and it is the marginal coping stage. That's where people are really heavily overwhelmed, I think. But it's a gradual thing. People have characterized it as a frog in boiling water. You know, that thing, slowly it comes upon you. And it's in this stage that people start to experience this sense of no longer having the life or the relationship that they had before. And this quote is very poignant. It resonates with caregivers when we talk about it. And she said, because she was talking about her own marriage, Rachel Hadas, she said, "The silence was the worst. Silence not as in solitude or concentration, but as in living with, eating with, waking up beside someone who has nothing to say." Now, that's a particular, it is extremely poignant, but it also tells us something about, if we're talking about research here, then who are we researching? To research this person is very different than researching the caregiver who is providing care for their mother in Thornhill, and they live in an apartment down near the Air Canada Center, and they call every day, once a day, or they're working and doing things. These are very different phenomena. Okay. So we've scratched our heads a little bit about some of this issue of assessment, and this is not rocket science, I have to tell you, but we wanted to create something that would help to guide practitioners in the approach to caregivers, because there are no models readily available. There are questionnaires and things that have been developed that are quite detailed, but there really isn't an interview guide that's available to help the frontline practitioner, for example, a family physician, know what actually to ask a caregiver. I mean, how do you delve into this? So we developed this Dementia Caregiver Interview Guide, the Dcig, to look at risk, because we have a high-risk caregiver program at the Reichmann Center for those caregivers who are teetering on the edge of not being able to function. And the definition comes from Guberman, actually. The caregiver's well-being is in jeopardy and/or the care provided is deteriorating. So there are 6 categories. They're daunting if you look at them in a whole big package, but actually they're really quite commonsensical. We look at the number of years and the intensity of care, the characteristics of the person with dementia, because that's one of the key factors in determining burden, particularly behavioral issues. Because you know that the big problems with dementia are not the defining features of dementia, like memory or not being able to use a computer or dress. The big problems with dementia are behavioral. The aggression, the resistance, the anger, the upset, all of that. So the caregivers of the person with dementia, the caregiver characteristics. I emphasize the psychological characteristics, including their psychiatric history and so on. And many people come into caregiving with this background. The intrapsychic barriers to change, it's a little more refined. We've got some things to look at, but what's their coping style? How do they actually respond to problems? And thirdly, their own physical issues, especially if they're older, and their understanding of the disease and so on. Then questions about the environment, their barriers to accessing services, and the one defined question in the Dcig is, how many days in the last week have you felt that you've had more than you can handle or that you've been stretched to the limit? That's a global assessment of risk. This is not meant to be a scale where the Guberman scale, which is a long scale, adds up all these numbers and you get a score. This scale gives you a sense. It's not a scale, this interview guide. And you come out of it with an impression, it's like the global impression of change that has been used in other kinds of research. That's what the form looks like, if you're interested. And so we wanted to see if this is any value or not. And we did a comparative study. We took a convenience sample of 50 caregivers, and we compared them on the Dcig and the caregiver risk screen, which is the Guberman screen, which we took as the gold standard. I'm sure Guberman would be very happy that we think of her as the gold standard, which I think she is. And so we wanted to establish the concurrent discriminant validity for the Dcig. And in a nutshell, I wouldn't tell you about it otherwise, it correlates very well with that in terms of coming out at the bottom with being able to define the level of risk, which really is a kind of low, medium, high assessment. Once you have that, then you know how much more effort you might have to put in to the support of the caregiver themselves. And then you can delve more quickly into other approaches. So once you've determined who you're dealing with, then what helps? So evidence-based interventions, there are quite a number of them actually. Most of them tend to be sort of project-based research, often research-developed interventions, some of which get translated into ongoing care programs, but many of which are just very interesting in terms of defining what might work and what might not work, and then they end. Regardless, well-constructed programs are effective. Mary Middleman has a very effective program. We have an effective program. Pinkart does all of these meta-analyses and thinks that these programs are effective. What do? They improve caregiver burden, they improve distress and depression, physical health, reduced service utilization, and they are said to, in some cases, delay institutionalization. I'm not at all convinced that that's true, but it sure makes good sense if the government asks you why bother doing this. How to help. So what comes out of all of this, I think, is that effective interventions need to be targeted and specific to the individual caregiver. Because there's such a diversity, we have to frame our interventions so when we deliver care at point of care, we get to the specific issues for each caregiver. But they also have to be scalable. So we can be very helpful to an individual caregiver. How do we be helpful to everybody else? So I want to talk a little bit about both of those things. Effective caregiver programs, you can do good things doing what we're doing here. You can give a lecture, you can inform people about the disease and caregiving problems and all of those things, and you get a yield of some enhancement of capacity and ability. But if you're really, I think, going to be effective for caregivers fully, then what comes out of the literature and what has come out of our work has been that you need a multi-component intervention. Some form of psychotherapeutic element is important. Doesn't matter necessarily which form of it, but you have to attend to that inner aspect of the caregiver. It's got to be specific and tailored, as I said, and it has to be of adequate duration. And interestingly, the projects that are in the literature are about 6 months long, which is very low. Why? Because, I don't know, I mean, in a way it's arbitrary, but in another way, I think you need this intensity and duration in order for it to yield the kind of things that we really want it to do. And it has to address the dyad. That is, not just the caregiver, and not just the person with dementia, but the two of them together. The elements of effective programs include, naturally, practical resources, professional support. It includes knowledge of the disease and treatment interventions at a fairly, sometimes sophisticated level. I'm amazed at what caregivers will ask me about with death, because they get online, they research this stuff. The quick and dirty kind of, oh, well, there's this and this, and it doesn't really satisfy them. Anyway, it's beside the point, maybe. And then effective communication amongst the caregiver and the person with dementia, and problem-solving skills, so skill sets and skills training has increasingly become evident as the core of this intervention. And finally, addressing the emotional well-being. So those are the 4 pillars, I think, of a successful caregiving intervention. And this is our promo for the Cyril and Dorothy, Joel and Jill Reichmann Center for Alzheimer's support. That's Joel and Jill at the bottom, both generous and engaged donors. And they've stayed involved even after their money ran out, interestingly, because we wanted them involved. Cyril had dementia, and Dorothy lives in Montreal with the Order of Canada and is a force to be reckoned with. She comes in when we've had our advisory committee meetings. She travels from Montreal to come to Toronto to join those meetings. So we're comprehensive. Our goal is to take all of this background information and actually craft it into something that addresses caregiver burden. One aspect of that is the CARES program. It's a skill-building point-of-care intervention for vulnerable family caregivers. And they live at home and they're dealing with dementia. That's been our focus. Just to tell you that we're broadening that for various reasons to all brain disease at this point, and probably broader to all aspects of caregiving, because that's where the demand really lies. So we're taking what we've learned and broadening it. We use psychoeducation, but very specifically. We don't stand and give a lecture about dementia. The psychoeducation comes from each individual caregiver who are in our groups, and we respond to those questions. We don't try to do anything else. We provide hands-on skills training in communication using simulation techniques. We use standardized patients. We've worked with the same group for a long time, but we can train standardized patients in doing this. And this came out of a study by Henry Brodati, who worked with caregivers in the moment. I think they were in a hospital, caregivers working and dealing with a person with dementia in the hospital. He got very good results by coaching in the moment. Said to me that the best way to do this is coach in the moment, except that we can't get into everybody's home all the time. So we transformed that into a simulation process, and we thought very carefully about how to do that, and we've got a technique for it. The second component is addressing coping skills, and so we use problem-solving technique. PST is a manualized method. We've substantially adapted that for use with caregivers. Solution-focused interventions are not so different. We've got a seminar coming up on that. So PST and simulation are the core of the CARES program. And the program has won awards. Just to tell you that it's not just us who thinks that it's a good thing, but we allow ourselves to be looked at and to make sure that we're not deluding ourselves. So here are the factors that increase caregiver burden. Living with the care recipient. So we divide children and spouses, because spouses live with care recipients. Generally, children do not. Knowledge about dementia, I'm not going to go through all of this. But there are determinants of caregiver burden that need to be addressed in effective programs. Here's how we do it. We have a 10-week program. It runs every week. I'm doing one now. I'm in week 7 of the 10 weeks. Wednesday afternoons from 1 to 2:30. The caregivers come with the care recipient in general. The care recipients go into their own group. We've got that manualized approach to that population. And the caregivers come into their small group programs. In order to be specific, we can't have large groups. So there are 6-ish numbers in our groups. And in this process, we identify the specific problems of each caregiver. In that process, as these unfold, we do 4 sessions, 10 hours of PST training. We train them in PST. And concurrently, we are solving problems with them as they go. We're helping them solve them. We try to reframe them from emotion-focused into problem-focused orientation to what they're dealing with. So instead of saying, I can't stand this anymore, I have no idea how I'm going to cope, my life is over, they focus in on how am I going to address the problem of going out at 10 o'clock in the morning for 2 hours in order to get what I need done. That's what PST does. It goes from this very broad, overwhelming picture and takes things in very small bites. And I'll tell you the outcome of this in a minute. We coach them in 6 sessions, so about 15 hours, whatever that works out to, of simulation in engaging with the caregiver, or the care recipient, I mean. And in that coaching, things get very intense. They bring in a situation. I was trying to get my husband out of bed. He wouldn't get out. I pulled at him and he hit me. So we reenact that. The simulated patient, we don't hit anybody, but the simulated patient enacts that moment. The caregiver simply is themselves. This is not role-playing. And in the intensity of that moment, which often unfolds quite with a lot of emotion, that we coach in what's going on and also in what the underpinnings of their responses are. And so they work through emotions and also very practical how to do things differently. How to stand back, how to take a breath, how to communicate in these small sentences that we have to communicate in, how to talk in a particular tone of voice, what words to get out of your mouth. What's striking is how different it is to tell somebody what to do versus asking them to do it. And when they do it, it transforms this into something that they're able to take home. So in the last group yesterday, somebody said, my husband was yelling at me like he always did. I got furious, but I didn't say anything. And I just kind of stopped. And then I said something, I forget what she said, but something calm and quiet. And I'll tell you, if you knew this lady, you would never have guessed that she might have been able to adopt a different frame. But we had spent 3/4 of an hour with her the previous group, helping her address this feeling that she gets when he got angry at her, and then giving her a different set of approaches. So that's not an uncommon, it's not a one-off. It happens all the time out of these simulations. Okay, and the group process is also part of this. So it's 10 sessions, 2.5 hours each. The care recipient is in another group, and we have expert coaching and simulation. Before we started all of this, we looked at what factors we wanted to address. So we wanted to enhance knowledge and coping and reduce depression, enhance mastery, and improve relationship and interaction. We defined many of these targets based on what we wanted to do and what's measurable. And we measure everything. We have anyway. We still do this, although it's becoming less important, I think, now that we've got data. So we have these 8 pre-post measures. The coping inventory, it's got 3 components. Perlin's mastery, the Perlin's competence scale, and overload scale, because overload is one of the major issues. It's hard to measure. And then a depression scale, this SD, the Zarit burden, which is not a good scale for measuring change, and perceived stress scale. We also have evaluated the care recipient a little bit, but not a lot. So those are the measures that we use, and this is just one cohort. It was an uncontrolled study, I have to admit, but what comes out are significant change in coping and competence, in mastery, and in role overload. So if you can substantially improve all of those things, you've done a lot for caregivers. So coping competence, depression, and role overload are all statistically improved. And I tell you clinically as well. It's not just numbers. We also looked in detail at satisfaction, and people overall like this kind of program. So why is that important? It's important because you can offer things to people, but I have no faith in satisfaction outcomes, by the way, because people are often so desperate that anything you do feels terrific. But at least you want to know that the elements are acceptable. So the simulation, for example, can be very threatening to people when you tell them you've got to get up and do what you do at home. But in the main, simulation is both helpful and acceptable to the group. So we put all this together, we published it, and we've got that evidence-based. I'm not going to go into this particular piece, but part of our scaling activity has been to train practitioners in the community, CCAC care coordinators in this case. We trained them in PST for caregivers so that they could take that method into the home. And then we studied it. They really successfully adapted this. We published this paper, Tim Pauley and our group. We looked at 56 carers. We divided them into two groups, one with PST and one was a control. The intervention was 3 one-hour visits by a PST-trained care coordinator, and we looked at all these measures. The intervention group, and I have to tell you, I was actually very skeptical of this study and quite surprised. The intervention group significantly improved in their task-oriented coping, mastery, competence, and reduced emotion-oriented coping burden. And the control carers showed no change. I didn't put the graph up, but it's really dramatic. And I'm not sure what the active ingredient is here, but there was something in this process that
And
was
3
very
hours is a
effective.
pretty modest intervention to have that much outcome,
Yeah.
or that much change. Eh? Fabulous.
Right. So this PST training is a one-day intensive training, not intensive, but a one-day training for care coordinators. And we've trained 250 care coordinators from CCAC now. It doesn't matter. So we've got this thing. It sits inside Mount Sinai Hospital, inside the 4 walls. That's great. It does good work, I think. But so what? Right. So we took all of that and we've systematized everything that we're doing. And we've got our educational suite of tools. So first I wrote a paper manual of this, and as it happens, the implementation guide is translated into Chinese, both as proof of concept and that it can be culturally adapted, and also for practical reasons because we have a Chinese program that's running. We then created a PST training manual for professionals, and we put everything online, so we have an e-learning program that takes about 8 hours to go through, at the end of which you take the training. Carers training to run these groups is 3 days. And as daunting as that is, about 60 people have done that so far. I'll tell you about it. And we've mounted our programs on the web, so we can do the training on the web live, real time. We can train standardized patients on the web, and we can provide the carers program on the web. Internet, live, small group intervention. We use a privacy compliant program called Zoom. We're in the early stages of doing it, but we've done a little bit of research on it, and I'll tell you. And then we've added to our inventory, and those 2 apps are fantastic. They're just I would tell you. Anyway, this is what the screen looks like when we're doing live intervention. So we can do group leader training and deliver the programs at SP. So we do systematic tech preparation for the participants, whether they're professionals or caregivers. It doesn't take long. We do tailored training that is specific to the needs of the trainees, either caregivers or others. In the caregiver groups, we preserve the group dynamics and group cohesion, and we've measured this, we've studied it to make sure that we're doing it. And we have the live simulation activity as part of the overall program. So all the elements of the program can be put online. So does this kind of scaling work? Well, we've got 9. So when we have a satellite program, every organization signs an MOU with us. They're going to do what they've been trained to do. And they won't, it's not for profit, and that's part of the MOU. It's all free. There are 9 Ontario programs, most in Toronto, one in Guelph, one in Brant. We've got one in Alberta in the Chinese community. We've got a Chinese program up in Scarborough, running for caregivers. Our BC people have been trained. I don't know how many programs they're going to run, more than one, I think. There's one in Manitoba, Brandon, University of Manitoba, one in Israel, and one in Vermont. So we've got all these programs running. Are they getting the same effectiveness that we think we're getting when we do it in the mothership? So we've got a sample of over 100 outcomes, and the results are essentially the same. I'm not sure what the mastery problem is there, but so that's one point, I think. That is that you can take the program, use the interventions with trained personnel, and scale it. And the satisfaction is the same. That interested me. It is interesting to me that people actually function well online. It's true. Somebody did a study of schizophrenia in California, and that schizophrenics actually prefer to engage with an online presence rather than a real presence. So, not that we're schizophrenics, but still. Okay. All right. We've been funded to try to adapt this for the working carers population. This is an ESDC federally funded program. We're in, I forget which year, year 3.5 or 4 of this grant. And we're working with Ceridian, EAP, and we're hoping to work with the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. And we've got this qualitative data that caregivers talk about how tough it is to be caregiving and try to do their work. And Linda Duxbury in Ottawa has looked at this data just to quantify what we all know, and that is if you're doing this stuff, you can't work very effectively, and even if you're at work, you don't concentrate very well, and you get sick, and you don't take promotions, and all of that's true. So we adapted our program into a small group, weekly. We compressed it to 8 sessions. People complain it's not enough. I tell you. We use the same interventions, and we do the same thing with this group. And what did we find? First, it's extremely difficult to access working carers.
They're so busy, right?
Well, they're busy, but I think they don't want to identify themselves for reasons of stigma, or having to talk to their manager about getting time, or the organization doesn't embrace the need. So we've decided that instead of going through HR, we're going to go direct to the consumer, and we're going to do it, I mean, it's a grand idea, but we're going to do it using web-based, straight to their computer approaches. We'll see how that works. anyway, there is more to say about that, but just to tell you, there is an obstacle, not only to research, but also to engagement of this sector. But be that as it may, we got funded for a national working carers studies through the Canadian Coalition for Neurodegeneration and Aging, which is a CIHR-funded set of projects. There are 21 teams. You can study brain cells in a brain bank, or you can study caregivers on Team 18, which is our team. So it's multidisciplinary, multi-site. We've got 3 projects. One is a national survey of in-depth interviews. The second is a clinical effectiveness trial of our intervention, and the third is the adaptability and feasibility of the intervention for rural and remote areas. The survey has over 3,000 completions now. It's done. We've got 3 groups: elder care only, child care and elder care, and child care only. Guess who has the most trouble? Our sandwich generation. We also did a qualitative study. We haven't analyzed our data yet. It's just now finishing. We collected all the data. And the results we're just starting to look at. But one thing that's clear is that individuals involved in elder care compared to other caregivers are much more burdened and have much more difficulty. And 40% of those are coping with dementia. So that's an important target of intervention. The clinical effectiveness study, we've got to clean this data up. We haven't done it all, but we've got 94 dementia family caregivers who have completed our measures in the intervention. The caregivers with dual roles have improved caregiving competence immediately and at 3 months after. So we've got some holdover. And we've got some preliminary qualitative data from 21 caregivers suggesting that their coping strategies are shaped by their work culture and their environment. So how they do things is not independent of where they're working. We'll know more about that later. I just wanted to give you a flavor of this research. Final thing is this Rural Carers program, which has enabled us to study the acceptability of video intervention of using the Carers program itself. So we took 2 provinces because they're different, and the data shows that the geography makes a difference in terms of services, obviously, and also attitudes. So we took Manitoba, and Brandon, and Nova Scotia, Sheet Harbour, and Michelle Lopchuk, who's the Canada Chair in Manitoba, and Janice Keefe, who everybody knows probably, who's internationally renowned, and our little group. And we created a study to look at rural caregivers, to understand their needs in these places. And we adapted our intervention a little bit based on what we learned first from them to see if it would make it acceptable. We did 3 rounds of our intervention. 1 round was face-to-face, 2 rounds were online. And by online, I mean one of the group leaders was in Manitoba, the other group leader was in Nova Scotia. We trained leaders in both places. The participants on the groups were some from Manitoba and some from Nova Scotia concurrently. And so we had these, so it didn't matter where people are, they can be, the intervention can be delivered to them if they're in BC, taking time differences into account, or anywhere in the world. So this is very early. It's very, I'm not making too many claims, but I can tell you, just based on experience, that after running 3 groups, that this is a feasible and apparently effective intervention. I'm not going to bother you with that. So that's, I know I took the whole time. I just want to, I'll just say that the key issue then for research, I think, is first of all, being clear about what it is we're researching in caregivers, starting to parse out the sub-elements that need to be looked at more clearly, not lumping caregivers into one big box, but recognizing that we've got different subgroups, that there are aspects of caregiving that go on that affect the economy of the country, the workplace, and that if we're going to be effective, we have to figure out how to address that sector. Everybody knows that. The government knows it. They want to do that. They don't know how. So that's where we are. I'm sorry I talked so fast.
So everyone give a round of applause. So when I said you were busy, this is just your research component, which is it's so impressive how many different things you have going and the effectiveness of it. So it was a real treat for us to be able to see these positive, good news stories about really great quality care to caregivers, rural, urban, working. It was wonderful. We have just a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Now, I know that some people have to run, but would you take questions for a few minutes after?
Oh, yeah,
But please,
that's
if you're trying to get back to work or whatever, feel free to run. But are there any questions in general?
It's not a question, it's a comment that I think is very important for you to know about. I had made a referral to your center about 2 months ago, and my patient said, oh, just like your case, I can't ever leave him, and I said, no, you can bring him, and they will take care of him when you're receiving the help. And so I called your office or the center, and just to verify, and also I wanted to know about a waiting list. And I was told that they don't take the care recipient anymore. That's what and I had actually told a colleague that I work with about your program because her father had dementia with behavior problems. So I subsequently went to her and I said, do you know that they don't take the care recipients anymore? She said, no, I didn't know that. So it's really very important for you to know that that's it's not in my mind anymore.
Well, there were half a dozen care recipients there yesterday.
That's what I was told, right? So then, then I go and tell my colleagues, don't refer to the Reichmann Center because they won't take the care recipients anymore. So it's a kind of evil rolling ball that can happen. So just for you to go back and
thank you.
To correct that.
That's very odd.
Yeah.
Because it's not true.
I know. Well, I was surprised.
Yeah, I'm surprised
but I thought,
too.
They changed their approach.
So we're both surprised. I'll find out about that in short order.
Yeah, please,
Caregiving or cognitive decline impacts the entire family system. So there's the principal caregiver, often a spouse, but also there are adult children. So how do you address the impact on secondary caregivers, or is that something
yes.
to think about?
So conceptually, it's not a problem. Conceptually, family intervention, family group intervention is a very good thing. And the Middleman method, for example, is designed to actually bring the family members together to ensure that the primary caregiver has the support of everybody in the family. But that's the basis of their theory of how to best address this, and it's a pretty good theory, I think. When we talk about this in our clinical intake, I will often say to my colleagues, we should see this family. The trouble is that people are well trained in individual work, and they're not well trained in family work, and they're daunted by the idea of bringing a family together. They don't quite know what to do. So I personally do family work with those individuals. So I would say this, your comment is dead on. It's exactly right and needs to be addressed. The skill sets required to do that have to be created and developed. We don't have that embedded in our program. Individuals will do that, but it's not embedded. And it's a deficit, I would say. What we do is sometimes put the children into a group, but a separate group. And they bring their care recipients. Contrary to...
Just wanted to ask about the folks that received the training, the 10-week skills and acquisition. Is there any sort of look later to see if they've sustained that ability to keep using those skills and training? And how does any of that get, the fact that somebody's done this program and they're making different kind of interventions with the person that has dementia, how does that at all get incorporated into sort of the medical record? And do other health professionals that interact with that dyad understand that they've undergone this? And how is it linked to other care services?
When we get referrals through the medical system, well, first of all, the person that is engaged with the medical system is usually the care recipient.
Right.
And because they're not the primary component of our work, we are restrained from being able to communicate with the medical system that's looking after them. Sometimes, when we're lucky, the referral will come from the person who is looking after the caregiver and at least the care recipient, and by extension the caregiver. Then we get back to them and we communicate. But I think that we don't have a system in which the dyad is the unit of care.
Right.
And that's, I think, a major problem. I've written a little bit about that, and I think we've got a lot of work to do to transform the way in which both assessments and interventions are conducted. If we could do that, then it would be much easier to engage with the medical system. That's the first thing.